I'm Celia, and today I'm going to be talking about my 22 favorite books from 2022. 2022 might have not been the best year for me. I did receive a fortune cookie in June, which was after I had already broken my foot and gotten COVID on the day of my prom. I got a fortune cookie that said that I was gonna have bad luck until winter. And then I think that pretty much happened. But it was not a bad luck year for reading. I read lots of good books this year. I think I read a total of, a little more than 75 as of right now. It's still not even Christmas yet, so hopefully I don't find any new favorite books between now and Christmas, but we'll see. This is in no order according to which ones were my favorites, because I cannot do that physically. That would tear me apart. So my first favorite book of the year that I read this year was On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, which was actually the second book I read this year. This is a book about, it's sort of a letter, and it's very poetic, and it's a letter that Ocean Vuong is writing to his mother, who cannot read, so she'll never be able to read it. And it talks a lot about his life, his identity as an Asian American, as well as his identity as a gay man. And my personal favorite part was when he was talking about his first relationship. It was so incredibly heartbreaking, and then the man that he had his first relationship with passes away, which was doubly heartbreaking to read about. It's the relationship was hard to read about, and then the death and the grief was hard to read about. It's just really, really a beautiful book. I recommend it to anybody who loves poetry, loves very artfully written sentences. Okay, and my next favorite thing that I read this year, number 2, is Fleabag, The Scriptures, which is a collection of the first season and the second season script of the TV show Fleabag. This is the funniest thing ever written, I swear. Phoebe Waller-Bridge is a genius, and she's absolutely hilarious. And at the same time, she's a genius because she pulls at my heartstrings. So, Fleabag is a troubled woman. I think that's a good way to just describe the whole thing, honestly. So, the first season of Fleabag is really about a woman who's very self-destructive because her friend just died, and a lot of very sad things have happened in her life. Her self-esteem is kind of, I don't know, she portrays herself as if it's very high, but it's really pretty low because she's recently done something really bad. And yeah, I'd say the first season is more depressing than the second, and then in the second season, the hot priest shows up, and that is so fun. And then it kind of turns into a fun little romance moment. Obviously, it still has very important things to say, but if you like the show, I would recommend reading the script, because the more you can focus on the actual writing of it, the better. But if you haven't even seen the show, reading the scripts is such a good time. Now, my third favorite book of the year I have right here, and it's Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I want to read more Ishiguro because I've only read this one, but this was genius. It's about all of these kids. It's hard because I don't want to reveal too much. You don't know what's happening until near the end. But these kids are growing up in this school that really emphasizes artistic expression, and then this is sort of an exploration on what it means to be alive, the importance of art and music and artistic endeavors to explore humanity, if you can show someone's art, does it convey that that person has humanity? Sort of a coming of age book, but it's also a dystopia, and it's also kind of creepy because it's a dystopia, but it's really sad because there's a lot of death, a lot of discussions on death and grief and who deserves to live in dystopian society type of stuff, and yeah, but I highly recommend this. I actually read this as a library book, and then I had to buy it because it was so good, so now I own it. And then my next favorite book of the year is a really short one, so if you want something short, pick it up. It's actually in my college dorm right now, so I don't have it, but it's Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. This is a collection of letters to, guess who? A young poet. It explores like how one should live their life, like what the ideal life is. I mean, Rilke doesn't force it onto him, but Rilke kind of offers suggestions on how to like greatly enjoy your surroundings and just enjoy the beauty of the things around you, and also just on how to write poetry. But to a certain extent, when you're reading the parts about like this is how you should focus on writing your poetry, it also applies to how you should live your life. Okay, and the next book that is on my favorites, 22 favorites for 2022, is Want Me by Tracy Clark Flory. This is a nonfiction book that's all about sex and like how people present themselves and what people want, and also sexism and the influences of the patriarchy on how women view sex. You can kind of tell by the title, like Want Me, it really discusses how women tend to cater totally to, and I'm talking very heteronormatively right now, cater totally to male partners because of like patriarchal values that are kind of embedded in society. There's this beautiful section where Tracy talks about finding like the love of her life, and he didn't want all of the things that she had been pressured by society into thinking that he would want from her, and when she tried to like give those things to him and act in that way, he didn't like it, and it like set her off. Obviously it was like a big hurt to her self-esteem, and then she sort of realized like maybe not all men want the same thing, and maybe I can have fun during sex instead of just trying to cater to the male gaze that exists in my head. Yeah, so this is definitely a very interesting read. Shout out to my friend Delaney for recommending it to me. Love you, TY. And my next favorite book of 2022 was Inseparables by Simone de Beauvoir. I actually listened to this on audiobook. I loved this little book. This is another quick one if you want a really quick book to pick up and read. It's all about friendship. And it's about friendship that is like so full of love. And almost, it's interesting, it feels like it can get a little bit possessive or controlling at times, which shows the complex nature of like female friendships. But for the most part, I found myself reading this book and just thinking, this is how I think about my best friends. Like, the narrator would just be sitting in the corner watching her friends, like, navigate a room and just noticing all of the, like, amazing things about her friend and what her friend was doing and how beautiful she was. And she was always talking about how her friends are better than all the men who were, like, flocking to her and all the men she was with. And I just loved this book. Next book that I really enjoyed, I actually read this one for high school, which was interesting because it's kind of inappropriate at times, was Atonement. This story is about perspectives. It's about the idea of atonement, like what a person can possibly do to atone for actions that are like completely unforgivable. Because the main character in this book does something to another one of the characters that is legitimately unforgivable and legitimately ruins his entire life. She is grappling with like, okay, what do I do? Is it forgivable because I was a child when I did this thing? Like, how do I atone for this action? And it's hard because you read it and as the reader, you're almost like, I cannot see a way in which she could possibly atone for what she has done to this man. You know what I mean? But you want her to be able to find something, or else it feels like there's almost no point. There's a character in it named Cecilia, and I loved Cecilia, so me and her are like this. My next favorite book of 2022 was 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. This is a romance. I don't read that many romances, but I loved this one so much. I read this over spring break, and sometimes I have to say it did get a little bit cheesy, but I feel like a lot of romances do, where I think there was one part where they were like, you know, like making out or whatever, and she was like, oh my god, total #body goals, or something like that, and I was like, ooh. Like, why would you write that in a book? I was just totally removed from the moment. But if you can get past those kind of moments, like, you'll be fine. And it's about this woman, and she is grown up now. She writes books. She writes, like, romance, fantasy books. And then there's this guy, and he writes, like, very serious, like, literary fiction novels. And they dated for 7 days in June in high school and had this sort of like problematic relationship because the guy was like really addicted to drugs and she was really like trigger warning for like self-harm. Like she was very depressed, and then they hung out for these 7 days, and then she ended up, that's kind of a spoiler, I won't say. Anyways, they reconnect years later. He defends her at a literary event because people are sort of critiquing her, like, romance, like, fun little moment. And he's like, no, like, she's a really good writer. And then they reconnect. And it's so cute. I absolutely loved it. Yeah, I'd highly recommend, especially because I'm not someone who loves romance super much, unless it's, like, Sally Rooney. So, next book, that was one of my favorites of this year, was Leave the World Behind by Rumen Alam. And if you want to see something cool about this book, it's signed. I actually met him when I met Carmen Maria Machado. I went to a like talk that they did with my friend Ren, and it was like one of the best nights ever. This is a genius book. It's so good. It's about this family, and they're staying in an Airbnb. And then all of a sudden, the world starts ending. Owners of the Airbnb come back, and they're like, well, this is our house, and the world's ending, so we fled the city, and we want to stay in our house. And there's sort of these, like, power dynamics going on between the people that have a lot to say about class and just, like, the system of Airbnbs in general. The writing style of this, I think, is what really made it so great for me. It was very, like, snappy, to the point, almost like direct in a jarring way sometimes, but also still very mysterious. Like the story was very mysterious, and yeah, I would highly recommend, and so would Jenna from the Today Show. So who are you gonna listen to, me and Jenna, or I don't know who's telling you not to read this book. You might as well read it. My next favorite book of this year was The Seas by Samantha Hunt. This is a absolutely crazy book. To be honest, I picked this up because my boyfriend at the time's name is the name of the love interest in the book. So that was kind of my motivation for picking it up, but I found like the most nuts story ever. This story was so good. So it's about this girl, and she thinks that she's a mermaid. And she's in love with this man who's like years older than her, way older than her. He was in the war, so he has PTSD, and he also has a drinking problem. So does like everyone in this town. This girl's father was lost at sea like years ago, and so she's convinced that this man who she's in love with is like, not that he is her father, but she sort of sees him as like a father-ish figure, but then she also falls in love with him, and then eventually a bunch of crazy stuff happens. I honestly can't tell you too much about this book other than that it's a very unreliable narrator because she thinks she's a mermaid, and also she kind of goes absolutely crazy toward the end, and everything that you're hearing her say you kind of know is not what's actually happening, and once you figure out what is actually happening, it's really sad. And my next favorite, and I don't know if this really counts, but my next favorite is the Heartstopper series. I was trying to think of the word for trilogy, but four. Is there a word for that? I feel like there probably isn't. Quadrilogy. Heartstopper series. This is about Charlie and Nick, who are two high school boys, and then they fall in love. And there's a lot of side characters, and basically everyone in these books is gay, so if you're looking for some representation, this is where to go. It covers some dark topics, but honestly it's mostly just like a fun little like giggly, like you're reading it and you're like, ooh. I literally would sit down, when I got these books from the library, I'd sit down, read them in an hour, and just smile the whole time, and then get the next one, read it in an hour, get the next one, read it in an hour. Just great. Highly recommend. My next favorite book of the year is The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. This is a collection of essays in which John Green rates things. That's probably the best that I can describe it. He rates things. So, for example, he'll rate sunsets. And I remember he gave sunsets 5 stars. I think it was the first thing that he gave 5 stars. And then he tells a long, complicated story about why he gave sunsets that rating. I think this is a great book for just reminding you how great all the little things in life are. I just thought it was so beautiful. It made me so happy, and other times it made me so sad. He wrote it during the pandemic, so it discusses some things about like COVID and everything, which wasn't particularly timely when I read it, but of course I remember. I remember when the pandemic was like crazy, so I would highly recommend this book. I'm sure you've heard about it. Lots of people love it. This next one I'm recommending is a little bit more niche. Me and my dad both read it, and we loved it and thought it was like the craziest book ever. I checked it out from the library, and I told my dad, like, I think you would like this, because he likes a good, like, crazy, short little, like, what is going on, very literary book. And he loved it. He was like, Celia, you have to read this right now. And it's called The Iliac Crest by Cristina Rivera Garcia. And I, like, can barely describe what happens in this book. There's this person, and he's very confident, like, I am a man. And then one day, this woman shows up at his door and is claiming to be Amparo Davila, who's a famous author, and is like, you're a woman. And she shows up with his ex-girlfriend, and then these 2 women are staying in his house, and they keep being like, we know your secret. Yeah, we know your secret. You're a woman. And then he stays in an insane asylum at some point, and you find out all of this background about these women, and you're like, is that actually the author, Amparo Davila? Or is that someone pretending to be her? Why are there multiple people pretending to be Amparo Davila? What is happening? These are often thoughts that I had while reading this book. In the end, had me like gasping a little bit because it was just so crazy. So I highly recommend for a quick read if you like something that's like just nuts and you're gonna be like, what the heck is going on? This is what I recommend. And the next book is Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. I love Sally Rooney so much. It's 4 people. 2 are like young, I think they're freshly graduated from college and they're poets, and then there's the older two people who are a couple who are older and they have money, and then one of the younger girls starts sleeping with the older man who's in this couple, and it's very complicated. This book deals a lot with friendship, also like age and power dynamics, and dynamics with money too, which is a classic Sally Rooney venture. Also, it talks about endometriosis, which I thought was very well done and well covered. Very Sally Rooney. If you like Sally Rooney, you're gonna like this Sally Rooney. The main character is pretty all up in her head. She's pretty self-deprecating. There's lots of complex relationships in this, both friendships and romantic relationships, which is another classic Sally Rooney moment. And they just made a TV show. I heard the TV show isn't very good, to be honest, so I haven't watched it, but it has Joe Alwyn in it, which is cool. The next book I recommend is The Houseguest and Other Stories by Amparo Davila. You might be thinking, oh my god, I recognize that name. And that's because you do recognize that name. She is the author who is mentioned in The Iliac Crest, which is why I ended up picking up this collection of short stories. It was absolutely beautiful and heart-wrenching and confusing. The first story is about these two little creatures, and they're like following this man around, and you're not sure what the creatures are, which is interesting. I think that I thought of them as cats, and they're like terrorizing him, and that was a fun story. A lot of the stories kind of deal with interpersonal relationships with like occasional fantasy mentions in there. The House Guest is about this man who's friends with like the husband of this woman who comes to start staying in their house, and then is just like it's slowly eating away at the woman, and it's a very clear commentary on patriarchal systems and men being scary. But I absolutely love these stories. I was reading them by the poolside, and I got through them quick. And one thing I do recommend with this book is maybe buy it, because there are a lot of lines you will want to underline. And my next favorite book, I also own this one, but it's at college, was My Body by Emily Ratajkowski. This is genius. This memoir about Emily Ratajkowski's life and how being extremely beautiful has influenced how she's lived her life. Which, for me, I hear that description and I think that's not particularly relatable. I don't know how much I'll be able to jive with these stories, but she discusses like her experiences with sexual assault, which was very enlightening, and also is something that can be relatable to people who aren't supermodels. Everybody's a supermodel in their own right, but you know what I mean. Because some of the problems in here are very supermodel problems. But it was interesting how she covered how much beauty was emphasized by her whole family the whole time she was growing up. And her discussions on jealousy were some of my favorite parts of this book. She would talk about how her now ex-husband would say something like, oh, there's just so many beautiful women in the world. And even though she knew that was true, hearing him say that like made her stomach churn and like all the hairs on her neck stand up. Like it just made her feel horrible. And she sort of comments on that, and I thought that was really interesting. The next book that I read this year and really loved was The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. I think I just really like this because this is my first Hemingway. I need to read more Hemingway because my favorite things about this book were just how witty it was. I feel like a lot of the character dialogue was very snappy back and forth, witty, very funny, like almost laugh out loud funny. So this is about a an author, who goes to Mexico with his friends and also a past love interest of his, Brett. There's a lady named Brett who's his former love interest, and she's sort of like getting with some of the men on the trip, which ends in a lot of like bruised egos. And I think one of the points of this book was that you weren't supposed to like Brett, but I kind of liked her. Like, I kind of thought she was slaying a little bit. She was sort of messing with people's emotions, which isn't good, but I don't know. She was kind of doing it in a fun way. Every part that she was in was like one of my favorite parts of this book. This also has to deal a lot with bullfighting, and really the like overarching theme is about like the lost generation, and also it kind of seems to touch on like toxic masculinity and relationships and people just being really lost and using their money for things that they really didn't need to use their money for, you know, stuff like that. But I think I need to read more Hemingway because I really liked the writing style of this book. This next one I think might be really, really up there for my favorite of the year. It might be my favorite of the year. And that is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This book is so good. This is the type of fantasy that I like. It was so comforting. It was so, like, the scenery was described so well. It almost felt like I was there. The whole time I was reading this book, it felt like I was in the Starless Sea and surrounding areas, and I was like, I just loved it so much. I was so sad when I finished this book. So this book is about this guy, Zachary, and he finds a book in the library, and then he's in the book. And he's like, wait, what? I'm in this book? Basically, that's what happens. And then he tries to track down, like, how he ended up in this book, and he tries to track down this secret society, and then he's launched into this like fantasy world, and it follows so many different perspectives, and you get to hear the stories that they're reading in the book, and it's like a lot of pieces to piece together, but that's what makes it so fun. It was literally like the most fun book I think I've ever read ever. It was so good. And my friends recommended it to me, so thanks guys. I loved it. Very cozy, like very, very cozy. That's the main thing I would say about The Starless Sea. And it sort of discusses literature and the importance of literature and relationships and, you know, just classic book stuff. My next favorite book of 2022 is Funny You Should Ask by Alyssa Sussman. This is the second romance on this list. Interesting. This book was just like a good time. It's about, well, I think it's based off of Chris Evans and this girl who interviewed Chris Evans, but I could be wrong. Like, I think this might have originally been fan fiction. It's about this woman and she interviews her celebrity crush. They immediately hit it off, and then they have like a short 2-day romance, but then she goes off, she gets married to her ex-boyfriend, he goes off, he gets married to his co-star, and they hate each other. But then her agency's like, hey, we want you to interview him again. And she's like, okay, I'll say yes, but I don't really want to. And then the romance rekindles. It also talked a lot about how women's like success is often pinned on the actions of a man, and how it's often diminished because the main character's ex-boyfriend would diminish her writing all the time, and also the press would diminish her writing because she got famous for writing about this celebrity that she eventually falls in love with. My second to last favorite book from my 22 favorite books of 2022 was Post-Traumatic by Chantel B. Johnson. I just read this book. This is about a lawyer who works in conjunction with a mental health facility, and she tries to get the patients out of the like mental health facility. And the issue is that that's really hard to do. And she's trying to defend these people, and it seems like the root of her desire to get them out of the situation is based off of her childhood trauma. I would say trigger warning for almost everything in this book, to be honest. It has a lot of discussion about this woman's current mental health. For example, she's very controlling over her life. She has a eating disorder. She really wants to cut off her family. She's obsessed with like romantic validation. She gets just like obsessed with men and like gaining their attention and validation for her body and the way she is. And but I think what I really appreciated about this book was that by the end she starts turning it around, and you're really rooting for her, because as much as some of the things that she's saying are awful, it's also like, well, you can see where it came from in her past. Yeah, but it's a book that really discusses trauma, which you can tell by the name, post-traumatic, and I really loved it. I think it was a really in-depth character study and very interesting to dive into her head. My final favorite book of the year is actually the book I'm reading right now, which is Acts of Desperation by Megan Nolan. This book right now for me is kind of a lot. The main character in this becomes obsessed with this man who has a very Irish name. What's his name? I have no idea how to say that. Chiron? I don't even know how I've been pronouncing it in my head while I've been reading this book. She becomes obsessed with him, like obsessively in love with him, and then, but he's still in contact with his ex-girlfriend, who he had dated for like 7 years, and he is not very good at being a partner. Like, he does not give her the attention that she needs, and she's willing to do literally anything for him. She seeks all sorts of validation in him. She seeks his love more than like anything. And then I got to a point very recently in the book where he showed up to her apartment after not talking to her for a few days and just completely dumped her. That was a little bit too much for me right now. I was like, do I have to read this book right now? Like, are you kidding me? But I think the worst parts of me are very similar to this girl right here, which is why I'm enjoying this book, because it almost feels like a character study of me, sort of, but I'm not quite as bad as her. I'll say that. I know that that sounds like maybe I'm lying, but I don't think I'm lying. I think I'm a little better off than she is. Here's a quote that I think summarizes like her attitude towards everything. She says, "Being with other people was, to me, the feeling of being realized. This was why I wanted to be in love. In love, you don't need minute-to-minute physical presence of the beloved to realize you. Love itself sustains and validates the rotten moments you would otherwise be wasting while you practice being a person, pacing back and forth in your shitty apartment, holding off till 7 to open the wine." Yeah. Anyways, so I hope you got some recommendations from this. Those were my top 22 books of 2022. Yeah, if anyone's watching this, leave a comment. Let me know what books were your favorite. Please do, though. I'm being for real. And, okay. Thanks for watching. Bye. Love.